Let me first start with a confession. Number one, I am not a liberation theologian. I am a contextual theologian. Very different. Secondly, I live in the Philippines, but I work in Asia Pacific. But my home is in the Philippines. I know something about the Philippines, but my knowledge or my work area is in Asia Pacific. Thirdly, when they gave me the topic, the question, I said they have the wrong person. As you might have read, I do stuff in leadership, but I don't do stuff in sacraments. So trying to interface baptism, liberation theology, and then leadership was a challenge, but I'm going to try. And lastly, I'm going to ask if I shift the image from construction to deconstruction, not the workers on the site. I want to go to the architect. I feel that if we are going to construct or deconstruct a church, or the system or the structure of the church, we need an architect. And I'd like me to take you that in order for this to happen, we all need to be builders, but we also need the skills of being an architect. And then lastly, one of the biases is this. I am starting with the statement, and Teresa Berger, this is one of your answers. If we want to go from baptismal consciousness, we need to learn pastoral consciousness. Baptismal consciousness is still in the fetus. We need to grow up. And when we grow from baptism, then I'm claiming that we need pastoral consciousness. And this is a list of 10 which we have developed in Asia Pacific, and you will see it's both and, not either or. For pastoral consciousness, you need the paschal mystery, which is, baptism is part of that. But you also need the spiritual experience, both. You need the people and you need the priest, both. You need paradoxes and live with paradoxes or contradictions, but you need doctrine. You need processes, but you also need structures. You need to be practical as a pastoral. You need to know in your conscience that pastoral is practical or practical theology, but you also need ritual. Without practice and without ritual, the pastoral consciousness is still a fetus. You need a place or context, but you still need the Spirit. You need plans, but you need relationships. You need power. If you talk about pastoral consciousness, you can't say that power is not part of it. It has to be. And the previous speakers, we've been talking about the power of this priest. But we have a lot of power. And in the theory of leadership, we call ourselves, who don't want the power, reluctant leaders. And there is such a theory as reluctant leadership. Power and service, participatory, but you still need the hierarchy. You can't distance them. They have to come together. And the last, you need the church and the universal parish. So I'm saying that part of this challenge that we face, and this is an Asian part where we live in paradoxes. And so I will talk about the paschal mystery, the paradox, and maybe participation. So let me try and answer this question. How can baptism become an impulse for liberation. Reflections on the perspective of liberation theology in the context of the Philippines. This question presupposes a deeper or a basic understanding of baptism from the Catholic Church. And this is directly out of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Through baptism, we are freed or liberated from sin and reborn as sons and daughters of God. Baptism not only purifies from all sins, but makes the Nephite a new creature, an adopted son or daughter of God, who has become a partaker of the divine nature, member of Christ, and co-heir with him, and a temple of the Holy Spirit. Baptism, like the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites, is a time when we literally experience again the liberation of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Therefore, baptism liberates us. However, how to keep that fact in our consciousness as we develop to become more Christian is what I'm going to try and give an answer to. Secondly, because some of us are aware of liberation theology, some of us just know that liberation theology is from Latin America, but liberation theology did come to the Philippines. And there was a time in the 1960s, post-Vatican II, early 70s, that quite a lot of theologians and priests were talking the language of liberation theology as segued from South America. However, let me just give you 3 facts of the liberation theology. We have to free men from all historical consequences and ravages of sin and selfishness in all dimensions of human existence. Salvation must include all forms of human liberation so that men and women and children can be called children of God. And lastly, which was coined in the Philippines, liberation must be the realization from freedom from before freedom for. Because freedom for is basically democracy, but freedom from is basic Marxism. But this freedom from and freedom for we needed to do. So those are 3 particular aspects of liberation theology. You will see they interface. Number 1, liberation theology and baptism interface with sin. So the focus of baptism, the focus of liberation theology is sin. And we have to realize the sin, both personal and social sin. And liberation theology brought that nature or that component of sin from personal to social and said, we not only sin individually, but we sin socially. The second part of it, that sin is a journey. We don't stay there. We journey from God, we come down and we go back to God. And so it's a process, and liberation theology is also a process. So looking at this, several speakers have said, okay, if we want to really use our baptism as a template or as a schema for leadership or for moving on, the 3, what I call functions, people use office, people use different things. But for me, it's a function. Because once you say it is an office, the priestly office, the prophetic office, the kingly office, it closes any discussion. It's easy to point to the 3, but try and live the 3. It's going to cause tensions. The 3 completely different aspects that we are asked to play. for us to be king, and I'm going to use the word king, for us to be prophetic, and for us to be the other one, priest, is difficult. And if any of you have got the answer to live those three offices day by day, please give me the answer. Because it is difficult. And this is the tension. So I'm saying that basically, if we want to move into leadership, number one, we need to know about tensions in our lives. And as this is a different movement, as you know, Descartes says clear and distinct ideas. In Asia, it's paradox. You live in paradox. And so we're called to live with these tensions. And so what has happened, and the previous speaker just talked about suffering, we need to live in suffering and see the tension that it causes. And we need to also know that tensions or paradoxes or even contradictions are not always bad. And I want to suggest that if we live in tension for a time, we will see creativity. But as when I was asking the question yesterday, short-term speed, we don't give time for tensions to mature, and therefore we just carry on. So I'm going to sort of take three persons who I think have lived in tension, who have also advocated liberation theology principles, and I'm also going to go to the theory of leadership, which that's the most I know about. And the first one is this Bishop Giulio Libayan. And I call him a transformational leader. And I'll just go through quickly. But he said this, tension one, how do you have a revolution and have the church of the poor at the same time? And he actually said this word, by virtue of our baptism, we are challenged to transform the church from an institution intensely focused on itself and well-being to a living self-sacrifice church that is a herald and midwife to God's reign on earth. I think Pope Francis stole this from him. This is 1970s. He said this. He made a decision that liberation theology was going to be his theology. And as you know, one of our persistent, consistent challenges in the Philippines is poverty. The tension between the very rich and the very poor is very marked. It is very, very marked. I work at university where they come with Mercedes-Benz, all those cars. But just one step outside our university is abject poor. How do you reconcile this? And so he said, I'm going to look at the poor. And so this tension that he decided, I will live with this tension. And he said, this process, from and to. So in order for us to be able to sort of be pastoral leaders, first we need a model. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we look and this imaginary figure is somewhere. We need to find good models. That's number one. Secondly, I want to go back. We need some theory. I get irritated with people when they say leadership, and I'm going, which theory are you using? I said, I don't know. Well, at the present moment, there's 9 theories. But we just roam around and we say words like transformational, transactional, or servant leadership, but we don't really know. We need to go to the theory and find what the theory is really saying. So I'm suggesting that we need a model. We need a theory. Next, we need to identify the tension in our parish, in our church, in ourselves. The tension between priest and leader and prophet is a daily struggle. When am I a priest? And when am I a king? And when am I a prophet? People say, you can do it all at the same time. If you can, you are lucky. Because it is difficult. Because we will get criticism, and somebody moves into management, leadership styles. Oh, that person is too secular. We concentrate on worship and sacraments. Oh, he's too priestly. Or we cry out and says, the poor. Oh, he's too prophetic. Where do you go? So this is the second thing. And this is, for me, the most important. That in order for us to be good leaders, we must know where we're coming from and when we're going. And Bishop Libayan had 4. He had many more. But this one, from being objects to becoming subjects of history. You see the liberation theology there. Instead of us viewing history, we become the subject of the history. We don't objectify history, we actually make history or our story part of the subject. From God of Christians to one God of all peoples, you'll see the Asian influence there. That because there's Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, and people in China who are atheists, he says, if we need to be a pastoral leader, we need to move from a God of Christians to a God of all peoples. And you know, if you do that, Rome will slap your fingers. If you say that the God of the Hindus are on the same par as the God of Christians, uh-oh, heresy. Next, from mission to pagans to mission to God's people. So the missiology is not to people who are unchurched. And this is what Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul did with a year of faith. Forget about going there. Let's go back to our own people. Let's go back to our own families and try to get them back to church. But in the missiology, many of people in the missiology, are we going out? No, we go in. Just stay home and do missiology at home. The next one, from a patriarchal culture to a culture of care and nature. We know about that one. From a political economic relation alone to a basic human relationship. So Libayan wanted his diocese to go that way. And I'm happy to say that he was successful. If you come to the Philippines and you want a parish or a diocese that's lived this, go to his diocese of Infanta. And participants from the institution that I head just came back and talk about conversion or metanoia. In 4 weeks, they came back and says, we've seen God. I said, well, take me there. But this is something that has happened. The second person is a Jesuit priest. Father Revelor was once, or he is, he's 95 now, but he was one of the top theologians who went to Latin America to study with those guys there, and he came back. And he's still alive, and he was very influential in the writing of the Bishops' Conference in Asia. But the tension that he cites is authentic spirituality and theological leadership. Can you have the two? That I am a theological leader, but I also have a very strong, authentic spirituality. And he cites that tension. Our theological education for participation in transformation is formation must be authentic spirituality of leadership. And I suggests that he is suggesting what the theory says of authentic leader. Authentic leadership is about 10 years old. The author is Avolio, an American, and it has come out of transformational leadership. And basically, it says that if we want to be authentic, start with self-awareness. Start with self-awareness and your own experience. And in Arevalo, to be authentic. And this is what Arevalo said. And for some people, is there a difference from studying theology and doing theology? Arevalo would say, yes, there is a marked difference from doing theology and studying theology. And this was an Asian movement in the 1960s, 1970s, where we studied theology, but we also did theology. And you can ask the lady from the Philippines about doing theology with BECs. But she's been doing theology. The next one is from the mind to real experiences and questions of the people. He was playing around here because basically he was saying systematic theology is good, but go to the context, go to the experience. Don't bring all these ideas and there is a disjunct between the theology and the experience. And so again you see these tinges of liberation theology there. From authoritarianism and impersonal discipline to personalism and community. Here he was talking about the church in the 70s and after Vatican II, where they said, they came down hard. They came down hard and says, this is canon law, these are the policies of the sacraments, this. And he says, no. Good, stay there, but can you be more personal? And if you want an example of this, is the October meeting of the bishops on divorced and married. And this is, can they start with persons more than canon law? Don't start with canon law. Start with persons. Start with the divorced and say, what do they really need? And then let's go there. But for a long time, there was no discussion. There was no discussion. And then a theology of liberation to a spirituality of liberation. Arevalo felt that the theology of liberation got itself into problems because it forgot the essential component of our lives, and that was spirituality. Because theology can be, you can think and do and conceptualize, but spirituality is your real relationship with God, the Creator. And as we all know, there are theologians who are not spiritual. There are many theologians that have no spiritual life. They're interested in theology as a discipline, but they're not interested in theology as understanding their faith and the relationship with God. So this is Arevalo. And the last one is Pope Francis. And I call him the paradoxical leader. And one comparison, if you want to compare Benedict and Francis, just on this. Benedict, or Pope Benedict, when he saw a situation and it did not make sense to him, he called it contradiction, and that was the end of the story. Whereas Francis, he looks at it and says, oh, paradox, tension, there's something good there. Let me go there. So just that two different attitudes, and he is a real paradoxical. And I'm using him because he came to the Philippines and certain journalists were sort of implying that he was again talking about liberation theology. And people says, uh-oh, he said he was not a liberation theologian. He got into trouble with the Jesuits in Argentina because of liberation theology, but he's coming again to the Philippines. But his take and paradoxical leadership is also in theory. There's such a thing now. And again, it's coming from Asia. How do you live the yin and the yang together? How? And the Asian says, you can. And China says, yes, I can make money and I can have my culture at the same time. So all the rest of the country, jump. So here, this is his statements in the Philippines when he visited the Philippines. He said, from looking at the poor to making them the center. So he wanted us in the Philippines, don't look at them. And I have to admit, I look at them. They're not the center of my life. But he wanted us to make them the center. The second, from not caring to breaking the bonds of injustice and oppression which give rise to glaring and indeed scandalous social iniquities. So he was telling us that we just don't care in the Philippines. So he wanted us to move from complacently to reforming social structures which perpetuate poverty and the exclusion of the poor. First requires conversion of mind and heart. We know that. This one is interesting. From piety, because all those who know about the Filipinos, they are very pious and ritualistic, or what we call popular religion, to acknowledging and combating the causes of deeply rooted inequality and injustice which mar the face of the Filipino society, plainly contradicting the teaching of Christ. So he really challenged us and said, this is the tension. How do you do it? And from intolerance to rejecting the worldly perspectives and all things anew in the light of Christ. It means being the first to examine our consciences, to acknowledge our failings and sins, and embrace the path of constant conversion. So, model, theory, process, to pastoral consciousness. And let me just end with my sort of conclusions. I have 3 conclusions. I'm trying to answer the question. Baptism can only be an impulse for liberation if we believe in the propensity to affect change in our lives as to attain salvation. We need to move from baptismal consciousness to pastoral consciousness. Number 2, liberation theology needs to incorporate a spirituality of liberation, for the spirituality posits the core principles of the work of the Spirit and the graces we receive when we are baptized. And number 3, with baptism, we begin a journey from God to God. And this will always be marked with tensions. We will experience the tensions of Christ as he moved between being human and divine. When he moved between the poor and the religious leaders. As he moved from being a community to being an individual in prayer. And as he moved from the death to resurrection. So liberation theology is still trying to experience Christ's mission to those who are not free, the sinners, the poor, the marginalized, the condemned. And it is here that we get the impulse. Thank you.